So I am making this video for myself note and as well as for people who are basically getting done with the loft or LOFT and the LOE and basically waiting for IOE and or OOE. Now, as you can see, the title says 400, which means it's based on whatever the airlines that the code. Now, I'm not going to tell you what airline code it is, but if you're the airline pilot training, I'm sure you will know which code is that for. Now, before I begin this whole video, just one disclaimer or couple, we'll see. Uh, use it at your own risk, please. These are the tips and tricks that I have received from many of my line check airmen and other captains that I have flown with. So everybody flies different. So you might get different advice from your captains or line check airmen. So if that's the technique that you want to use, then I would highly recommend use that because let's say you're going on the LOE check, or I'm sorry, the IOE check, and you're not doing what they haven't told you to do, and you end up getting, unsatisfactory. Well, I'll say it's quite obvious because line check airmates, they have their expectations, so they really want you to do what they told you to do. So unless they give you a similar advice, I would say if you get different advice, just use that advice the LCA has given to you. So that being said, using these techniques that you see here and you get into any incident or accident or any kind of FAA violations, please do not blame me. Like I said, everybody flies different. If you have to deviate from whatever tips and tricks or techniques that you have been taught, well, then you'll have to do it. As for those who are still working on the loft or LOE, my suggestion is just do what your sim instructor have told you to do. Simply because they're expecting you to pass, right? And in order for you to pass, they just want you to do what they ask you to do. So if they told you to descend at 3,000 feet per minute, well, then you'll just show them that you're descending 3,000 feet per minute. If they told you to descend 1,000 feet per minute, I'll just descend 1,000 feet per minute. Simple as that. So in this video, I'll have three different things that I'll show you guys. First is the regular star, so just descend via. And the second one is descending to an outstation. So outside of, you're basically flying to a destination. And last but not least, a modified star. So ATC might give you a descend via except maintain, or descend via except maintain, or speed 320 knots, or descend via except maintain 10,000 feet. Now, couple limitations to talk about. Now, I have recorded this video using my flight sim at home, but first and foremost, the descent profile here is Mach 0.77 to 320 knots, unless I'm flying at a low altitude or planned cruise speed is less than Mach 0.77 or is fixed to 300 knots indicated, then that's what it is. Second, lots of checklist items has been skipped. Couple reasons. One, the flight simulator I have at home has a limited functionality, and second, some of the items, I would ask the pilot monitoring to do it. So remember, we are focusing on a techniques as a pilot flying. Third is that we are using CRJ 700 here. I have looked around for CRJ 200, but I could not find any CRJ 200. So for those who have not been flown CRJ 700, sorry for you guys. Fourth is that I have skipped a lot of parts, such as the takeoff, climb, cruise, and landings. Now, we are focusing on descending, so makes sense that we skip these parts. I mean, cruise, you're not really doing much. Takeoff and climb, you have a set profiles to fly for. Landings, it's mainly skill based and technique based. So it's really something I cannot or we cannot talk about because once I throw how to land these CRJs, everybody will put a different opinions. Last but not least, some of the parts I have sped up. That way, we're not, stuck here watching my airplane just descending at a real time. So some parts that I did not add any commentary, I just sped up. Which brings to the last. I have recorded the flight first and then did a voiceover. So just be aware of that. So before we talk about the actual flying part, let's just quickly look at a decent profile or what we're trying to do here. So here we have a Victory 2 on arrival into DFW Airport. So we'll just say we start from Medano, then to Belfer, then Hull, down to Ledin, then to Zubov, then to Victory, come down to Zeeman, and depends on where you're landing, either north or south. You'll go to Thassa, Mori, Popa, or P-Hub. Now, as we notice, each waypoint has either no restriction or speed restriction and the altitude restriction. So our job is to make sure that we descend down to the airport while cross each restriction, right? So as we cross Belfer, we need to cross Belfer at 290 knots between flight level 300 to flight level 240, or say for P-Hop at the very end, you have to cross P-Hop at 330 knots or 230 knots, I'm sorry, and cross it at 5,000. So our job, like I said earlier, is to descend through these waypoints while meeting the requirements for each restriction or each waypoint restrictions. So now let's look at the profile itself. So we have Medano, so I'm going to just draw a square right there. Then we have a Belfer. Now we have to cross Belfer, say, from flight level 240 to flight level 300. Then we have Hull, and we just have to cross Hull at or above flight level 230. Then coming down to Leiden, which in this case to cross flight level 190 at no less than 17,000. Coming down to Zubov, 16,000. Actually, let me draw that a little less. 16,000 down to 13,000. Then we have Victory, 11,000 to 10,000. Then to Z-Man at above 9,000 to 7,000. So our job is simply to cross this fix like so. Our job is just descend by the profile without busting any restrictions. So most of the people will tend to do this. They will descend early, cross the fix, descend, cross the fix, descend, cross the fix, descend, cross, and vice versa. You're basically doing a step down fixes. Now, this is okay. If you want to do it this way, it is your freedom of doing so. Now, the problem with this, remember, if you remember the lessons from the ATP CTP, I remember my instructor telling me the simplest way to describe this is that you're basically staying at a higher altitude to go fast, and then you descend to land. So the whole idea of standing at a high altitude, there's a less air density, so you're basically moving really fast compared to you trying to fly at a lower altitude like 8,000 or 7,000. I mean, back before you even got into this ATP, CTP, or anything that has to do with a turbine, we all flew those piston engines. Now, we were told to, or at least my instructor, told me to descend and be ready, right? So it works for piston engines at, at a lower altitude, but we're talking, we're flying for the company at the end of the day. So they want us to save as much fuel as possible. So what we're essentially trying to do is we're trying to stay at a high altitude as long as possible, and then we start our descent. So instead of doing the step downs like this, let me do it this way. Instead of doing the step down like this, right, what we want to do is this. We really want to be at a as smooth as possible, right? Instead of making any step downs, we would just want to be in a constant descent, right? And that's our goal here, and that's what we're trying to do here. Now, for some reason, when I was in the loft training and the LOE, when I was doing the LOE, they wanted us to wait for 3,000 feet per minute descent and then to start descent. Now, this works when you're trying to maintain 320 knots indicated. So it works to some extent, but unfortunately, you start doing the LOE or OO, or I'm sorry, not LOE, the IOE or OOE. It doesn't really work that well. So once you go to the IOE, you probably going to hear your line check airman basically showing you different techniques like the one that we're about to do. So what do we want to do is, let's get rid of that. Let me just move this away. So what we really want to do is basically looking at the chart, right, the Victory 2, we're just trying to find that sweet spot, right? We really want to find that good rate of descent where we can cross each fix without having to adjust too much. All right. So the trick here, or at least what I was told to do. So let's go back to the chart, and I'm looking at the chart. So there's Medano, Belfer, Hall, Ledin, Zubov, Victory, and Zeman, right? So what I'm trying to do, or what we're trying to do, instead of looking at the fix that is immediately in front of you, you're looking ahead. You're basically looking at the fix ahead of you, like at least 2 or 3 fixes before, right? So looking at the chart, if you have a chart in front of you, you can look at it, the victory too. I'll just write it here. So looking at the chart, we have the Medano, Belfer, Hall, Ledin, Zubov, Victory, last but not least, the Z-Man. So I'm looking at 2 or 3 fixes ahead of me. So basically, like say Victory or Zubov. Now I could look at Ledin or Hall. That's my option as well. Or I can look at the Z-Man. Now I would not look at the Z-Man way too far ahead because one, from Medano to Z-Man, that's too far of a distance. That's for one. And two, you try to follow what the Z-Man's requirement is for the rate of descent. You might not be able to cross the fix before. So if I were to draw this, so let's say you're looking at the Z-Man as your target. And if the Z-Man is telling you to descend at a rate of 1500 feet per minute, what this is essentially doing, right? And when we look at the direct intercept, right? The direct intercept page, right? What the FMS is essentially doing is they just want you to descend at 1500 feet per minute to get to the Z-Man. So the problem is you might not be able to cross some of the fixes at whatever the restriction that you need. So for example, if the FMS does say you need to descend at 1500 feet per minute to Z-Man, you might not be able to cross Belfer between flight level 300 and flight level 240, right? So that's what we're trying to prevent that. So do not look too far ahead on the direct intercept page. So that being said, like I said, I wouldn't look at Z-Man too far, or I wouldn't look at too far ahead of the fix. Instead, I'll look at Ledin or Zubov, for example. So once again, I'm going to look at the direct intercept page. What I'm looking for is 2,000 feet per minute of a descent showing on the FMS for either Ledin or Zubov. Whichever one that shows 2,000 first, that's what I'm going. That's my cue to start descent. So at the end of the day, you might not be descending before Medano or after you might be descending after Medano in this case, right? You might be flying a little past the Medano and then you start descending, right? And as long as you cross Belfer between flight level 300 and flight level 240, you're in a good shape. But at the same time, I don't want to end up, you know, touching the top altitude. So for Belfer, right? Remember, it's flight level 300 to flight level 240, right? I don't want to plan to cross Belfer at flight level 300 because that means, or if we plan to cross the fix at upper limit, then we might not have enough time for us to get down to our final altitude, or in this case, 5,000 feet, where the P hop is. Right there. So that one has a hard altitude of 5,000, right? So if we just keep crossing the top altitude, we might not have enough distance to actually descend faster to 5,000. You can descend at 3,000 feet per minute if you want to, but that's really fast, first of all, and you need to cross the fix at a given airspeed too. So it's going to be very difficult for you to maintain those airspeed too. So always target the low limit or the bottom limit. So all you're doing as you start your descent, one, you just set the altimeter or altitude selector to your first limit. In this case, you just set it at 24,000 because that's where we're going, to the Belfer, right, at flight level 240. Two, you're still using the direct intercept page to look at your restricted or your most restrictive waypoints. In this case, I'm using either Leadin or Zubov to, I'll say, see most restricted. Then last but not least, at 2,000 feet per minute, descent is shown on either Leadin or Zubov. That's when we're going to start our descent. Now, you might want to add 200 feet per minute. So essentially, you're basically start descending at 2,200 feet per minute, really. One of the reasons is because we all know autopilot has that bit of a time delay between once it receives the new command for descent and to autopilot to actually execute it. There's about 0.2 mile delay. So we're just compensating for that. So that's for one reason. The other reason is we just want to be safe, right? We want to make sure that we can cross either Belfer or Hall within the given airspeed or the altitude limit. So you initially essentially start at 2,200 feet per minute, and then you're looking at the banana, right? That range to alt. So as long as the range to altitude is behind whatever the waypoint that you're trying to go to, then you know that you are well within the restriction. So to give you what I am trying to say, excuse me. So we have set the altitude of flight level 240. On the MFD, you'll have that waypoint with a buffer. And as long as the range to altitude is behind the buffer, so there's your direction of the travel. So as long as the range to altitude is behind buffer, then you know as you descend, you'll be at flight level 240 after you cross buffer. So which translates into that you'll be crossing buffer a little above flight level 240. And that's what we really want. And you just repeat the same thing as you cross the fix. So before the hull, you want to set the altitude to flight level 230, and you want to make sure the range to altitude shows that you'll be at flight level 230 behind the hull. Same thing for the lead-in. So lead-in, it has bottom limit of 17,000, so you will set the altitude selector to 17,000 feet, and you're basically monitoring the range to altitude is showing that you'll be at 17,000 feet behind lead-in, and then the Zuba Victory P-Hub, vice versa. Now, since P-Hub is a hard altitude of 5,000, this will be the exception where you will just want the range to altitude to be actually before P-Hub, because we actually want to cross P-Hub at 5,000. So this is the case where you could be, or you could level out before your waypoint, but not too far from it, and you will see it from the video. Far as the speed goes, now we all know at a level flight with a CRJ, we need 1 nautical mile for 10 knots. Remember, it's a level flight. Level flight and thrust idle. The problem with descent is that you're on a constant descent, at least like 1,000 feet per minute, or sometimes 2,000 feet per minute. So essentially, you can't really apply that level flight thrust idle 1 knot or 10 knots per nautical mile while you're descending via the arrival. Now, we do know, however, from 12,000 feet down to 10,000 feet, I'll just draw that like that. If you maintain 1,200 feet per minute with idle thrust, you will be descending from 320 knots to 250 knots as you cross 10,000 feet. So we have that. So that means at least when the thrust is idle and 1,200 feet per minute, we are losing the airspeed. So not only we are descending at a steady rate of descent rate, we're also slowing down. So you can basically from here you can add a bit of a distance. All right. So for example, using the same arrival, we need to cross, let's see, Zubov at 270 knots indicated. Now, previously we are crossing Leiden. Let me move that to the bottom. You need to cross Leiden at 290 knots. So we need to lose 20 knots between Leiden and Zubov as we descend. And distance between Leiden and Zubov is about 14.7 nautical miles. Now that's plenty of descent to slow down, Now remember what we said earlier, we don't want to slow down too early, right? Or I don't know if I actually said that earlier. Um, yeah, we don't want to slow down too early because otherwise, in order for us to maintain that airspeed, we're basically using a lot of power. So you just want to slow down as you cross the fix. So if we were to think this as a level flight, we just have to need 2 nautical miles to lose 20 knots. Since we're on a descent, instead of a 2 mile, right, we'll add a buffer, right? So looking at it, maybe we can add additional 2 nautical miles, right? So then essentially you would start slowing down, slow down 4 miles from Zubov at a rate of, or idle thrust, plus 1200 feet per minute. Yeah, that's bad. 1200 feet per minute. Now, I have done some measurements before. I basically tried out how many mileage it will take for us to reduce 20 knots at 1200 feet per minute. And my rule of thumb is with idle thrust, ah, with an idle thrust and at 1200 feet per minute, you will lose 20 knots with 5 miles. So that's what I usually use for a rule of thumb. So if I have to lose 20 knots, I basically just look ahead 5 miles. And then I go idle thrust, 1200 feet per minute, and there you go. So this means if I have to lose 40 knots, then I am basically just start slowing down at 10 miles or maybe 8 miles. It really depends. But at this point, you'd rather be safe than sorry, right? So you could just use 10 miles to start slowing down. So here's the first example that I'm going to show you with the video. So this one will show you a normal descent via star. We're basically coming from the San Angelo to DFW airport via booth 7 arrival. Now, like I said, I have cut the majority of the simulator flight video. So you will see that basically we'll start the video from the point where I'm about to start my descent to the point where we're basically crossing Delmo, and that will be the end of the video. So here we are flying from Outstation, it was San Angelo, to DFW airport. So we're basically flying back to the base. So ATC tells us to fly direct booth and descend via booth 7 RNAV arrival. So here, as you can see, I have my direct intercept page open. That way I can check when I can start my descent. Remember I said earlier that I'm going to be looking for 2000 feet per minute of descent, but not the immediate one, but whatever is giving me the most restricted or higher number or highest. So here I can see Curl and Mao is my candidate of 1100 feet per minute. Now there might be more points that giving me a steeper rate of descent on the far ahead. But like I said, I don't want to look too far ahead to the point where I might bust the lower limit of the waypoint. So to quickly look at, I have move at 280 knots between flight level 190 to 17,000. Then I have to cross shimp at 280 knots at 17,000 to 15,000. Then to curl at 270 knots between 15,000 to 13,000. Then Mao at 240 knots from 13,000 to 12,000. Then to Delmo at 210 knots, and we have to cross Delmo at 12,000. So like I said, or in this case, Delmo, yes, looking at it, is the most restrictive because this is the hard altitude. But looking at the star chart, right, we're still too far from Delmo. So that's why I'm looking at Mao or Curl. And as we descend towards the 12,000 feet, I can always, control the rate of descent later on. Now we're going to speed up a bit that way, or I'll just go ahead and edit the part of the video where we're just going to start our descent. So here we are now getting close to our target, the 2,000 feet per minute. So the first thing that I'm going to do is selecting a new altitude. So here I am setting the first altitude, the move in this case. So I'm going to set 17,000 feet, and I'm waiting for 2,000 feet showing on the active or direct intercept page. So there's my 2,000 feet at curl. So I'm selecting vertical speed, and like I said, we're going to start descent at 2,200 feet per minute. The only reason we do this is because there's been a delay. So as we all taught in the simulator, whenever we change the vertical speed mode and increase the rate of descent or decrease the rate of descent, there's always that 0.2 mile of a delay for autopilot to actually start descent. So to compensate that, we start with an additional 200 feet per minute. And as you can see now, I have reduced it down to 2,000 feet per minute because looking at the MFD, it shows that I'll be at 17,000 feet right on top of the booth. So I'm waiting to see what the rate of descent does, and as you can see, I have reduced it again to 1800 feet per minute, and I'm basically controlling my airspeed. Now here I'm still descending at 300 knots. I should be increasing to 320, and I was waiting for the upper limit to go up. That way I can safely increase my airspeed to 320 knots. So in here, if you look at MFD, the range to altitude actually shows that I'll be at 17,000 feet past the shimp. So in this case, now I can increase the rate of descent, as you can see that I have done just now. So I'm increasing, or I'm zooming in on the MFD map view, and I see the range of altitude is now showing that I will be at 17,000 feet just behind the booth, which is good because that means we'll be at 17,000 feet passing the booth. So now what I'm looking at is I'm making sure that I'll be hitting the top altitude of flight level 190. So usually somewhere 1,000 feet above the selected altitude, that's what I'm going to rotate the altitude knob to a lower altitude. So here we're approaching to booth. Remember, we have to slow down to 280 knots. Now, if this was a level flight, we could have wait till 4 miles, bring the power to idle, and just slow down to 280 knots. But remember, we are descending. Now, something what you can always do in this case, now we're really getting close to flight level 190. So what I'm going to do here, somewhere around 8 miles, I'm going to bring the thrust to idle or throttle to idle, reduce the vertical speed to 1200 feet per minute so I can still descend. So here I am, I'm doing that right now. And I'm going to select my target altitude on 280 knots. So this should comfortably bring the airspeed down to what I need. And as you can see, I have passed the flight level 190, so I know I have met my altitude restriction. So now I'm really going to focus on airspeed. Now, excuse me, you really want to meet the airspeed restriction before you change the altitude restriction, because remember, it's much harder for you to change the airspeed than the altitude of the target altitude. So still looking at the MFD, my range to altitude shows that I'll be at 17,000 feet just behind Booth. So once I get to 18,000 feet, now I'm going to rotate my altitude selector to the next altitude, in this case the shimp at 15,000 feet. And as you can see, with 1800 feet per minute of descent, I can still level out at 15,000 feet behind the shimp, which is a good sign. So now I'm looking at the altimeter, make sure that I'll go below 17,000. And as you can see, I'm passing the 17,000 feet, I'm sorry. And I'm going to wait until I get to 16,000 because I want to monitor the range to altitude to see what it's doing. So here now, once I know that I am be able to make it to 15,000 feet no problem without busting the shimp's altitude limit, I have rotated the altitude selector to a lower altitude for curl 13,000 feet. Now range to altitude shows that the curl will be basically at 13,000 feet just behind the curl. Now this is still good. So I'm going to keep it here. And now one thing I'm looking at is the speed restriction. So we have to cross curl at 270 knots. And just like we did before over at the Booth and Shimp, we're going to just, in this case, we have to lose just about 10 knots. So if we were level flight, we just need a 1 mile, but since we are on a steady descent, so what I'm going to do is bring the power back to idle, 1200 feet per minute, and I'll do that somewhere 3 to 4 miles. And now before I do that, I want to make sure that I have my next altitude selected. That way the airplane doesn't level out automatically. So here you see that I have reduced the rate of descent, and I'm going to select my new airspeed of 270. And I did it a little early. Now remember, as long as you're making a steady descent, you can always, expect to slow down a little earlier. That way you don't accidentally cross the airspeed restriction with the higher airspeed. Now, for this case, it was only at 10 knots, so it was very safe to assume that we could slow down from 3 miles or even 2 miles. So now the next target is mile. We have to cross mile at 240 knots and between 12,000 to 13,000. Looking at the range to altitude, 12,000 feet at 900 feet per minute, that's good. So we're still landing a little behind mile. Now I'm reducing the rate of descent here for two reasons. One, I want to slow down here soon, and two, I don't want to level out too quick to the point where I have to add power before Delmo. So here, as you can see, I reduced the rate of descent significantly down to 400 feet per minute, and I'm going to bring the power to idle, and I'm slowing down to 240 knots. And here I'm slowing down at 3 miles because 400 feet per minute descent is almost a level flight. So I know I have a confidence that I can slow down to 240 knots. But remember, using the speed brake is always an option. So here I'm getting close to 240 knots, and at the same time the range to altitude shows that I'll be leveling out just before Delmo. Now as you notice, we have to slow down to 210 knots here at Delmo. So in this case, yes, you want to level out at 1200 feet or 12,000 feet, I'm sorry. That way we have about 3 miles from Delmo. We can reduce the thrust to idle again and slow down to 210 knots before we cross Delmo. So here now I have set the vertical rate of descent at 500 feet per minute, and I'm just waiting really in this case. So once I level out at 1200 feet, I'm going to wait till, let's see, so from 240 knots to 210 knots, that's 3 or 30 knots to lose. So as we know, level flight, idle thrust, 10 knots per 1 mile. So I'm going to look for 3 miles in this case. Or if you're the kind of guy like me, 3.5 miles or 4 miles, just to be on the safe side, your choice. Now in this case, I do believe that I start slowing down at 3 miles. So here the autopilot is telling me that we have arrived at 12,000 feet. So here I am at 3 miles, bring the thrust to idle, and now I'm slowing down to 210 knots. Now once again, a lot of people get scared about, you know, 1 knots or 2 knots over or under the speed restriction. ATC really don't mind unless you're like big difference of 10 knots or 20 knots from the speed restriction. So here as I cross Delmo, I am exactly or close to 210 knots. And there you go. Now all I have left is just fly to Leary and B1 and just expect vectors to the runway or visual or ILS. So here we are on a descent to an outstation. So descending to an outstation really depends where you go. I'll show you two different methods that I've been told, or two different types. So remember, you're going to the outstation. Here's the runway or the airport. You might come from the opposite direction of the runway and you'll have to make a traffic pattern to land, or here's a runway and you just come straight in to a land. Now coming straight in, it's fairly easy as long as you know the distance, you know what to do. We'll still touch bases on this part. Now the difficult one, or at least for me personally, is the making a traffic pattern to a land because of the airspeed controls and whatnot. So we'll focus on this one, and even for the video itself, I've only did a one flight for or to demonstrate a traffic pattern. So we are planning on landing on a runway, and we're coming from the opposite direction. So there's the direction of the takeoff and landing, and our airplane is coming from the opposite side like so. So we need to make a traffic pattern, come down, and basically make our way down. So in order to do this without having to get behind on the airplane, what you really want to do is, here's the airplane, here's the airport. Let's say we're coming from south, coming up to the north, and airplane is, or the runway is a south runway. What we want to do is we stay somewhere around 5 nautical miles parallel to the runway. And we fly downwind and make our turn for the base and make our turn for the final and make a landing. Now, if they have a instrument approach available, then I would say your good reference point to turn base and to the final is the final approach fix. So you're basically doing a visual approach with an instrument approach backed up to it. So what you want to do now, initially, remember you're coming in at 250 knots because you are below 10,000 feet, unless you're not, and you're flying upwind. Now, we don't want to slow down too quick, right? Remember, we want to get to the airport as soon as possible. That way we don't lose any time or any fuel. So we're going to maintain 250 knots until we beam our airport or runway. So this is where we're going to slow down to 200 knots. And from here, it's really up to whatever is comfortable to you, right? So as we beam the final approach fix, you can slow down to 180 knots or 170 knots or even 160 even, right? And then as you turn final, this is the region where you really want to be fully configured. And that's what I'm going to demonstrate on this video, and this is the only video that I've made anyway, so. But yeah, this is the whole base of it. You don't really, there's no too much thinking, right? So from here, however, right, I'm going to draw a box here. So this is the area that a lot of people kind of get behind. So remember that you don't want to be too high or too fast. So either you are 200 knots and you are basically at traffic pattern altitude, or you are slower, basically slower than 200 knots, and you're still above the traffic pattern altitude. Whatever the case may be, you don't want to be both fast and high, right? So you will either have to reduce the speed or lower the altitude. Now, to me, what I would prefer is I would prefer slowing down first because, like I said earlier, it's much easier for us to control the altitude than the airspeed itself. Because remember, as you descend, airspeed will try to increase, right? So you really want to control the airspeed first. So the trick here, once we upbeam the airport, you want to really look at, right, this area. You really want to look at how high you are. If you're high, then use the flaps. Up to 80s. Not 80s, I'm sorry. Up to 20s. Use up to 20 degrees of flaps, and remember, by doing so, we're increasing the drag. Airspeed will naturally try to decrease, and we can increase the rate of descent to compensate that. Right. So you're still, bringing the power back down to idle or thrust to idle. Bring the call for flaps 1, 8, and 20. And as you see, the airspeed starts to decrease. Just increase the rate of descent. With 200 knots and flaps 20, I think it gives you somewhere around 2,500 feet per minute. With the thrust idle, of course. Now, if it's not the case, if you're not high and you're at 200 knots, well then that's good. Just use the flaps 1, 8, and 20 before you make that turn for the base. All right. So long story short, if you're high as you abeam the airport, slow down to anywhere below 230 knots. That way you're within that flap speed limit, and use the flap 1, 8, and 20 and start descending at 2,500 feet per minute, right? If you are low or if you're at traffic pattern altitude, right, just fly with flaps 0, 200 knots before you beam the final approach fix. That's the point where you can deploy the flaps to 20 and make your base turn. Now, for the base to final turn, let me draw this again. Here's the runway. We're within 5 nautical miles. So the point where you want to make a base turn, this is not good. There's the runway. We're coming here. Here's the final approach fix. As I said, if you're confident, you can make a turn for the base right after you beam the final approach fix. Now, if your sense tells you that you're not going to have enough time to get configured and whatnot, then just go a little further, right? Just go a little extra, maybe like a mile or two, and make your base turn. Get configured for gear down, flaps 30. Now you don't have to get gear down, flaps 30 at this point. Now, maybe if you made a base turn early, then maybe you will have to. Otherwise, you can wait. And then as you turn final, call for gear down, flaps 30. As you cross final approach fix, or after you cross the final fix, check spoilers, flaps 45 before landing check. Right. Now that's the basics of a visual traffic pattern at an outstation with no arrivals. Same thing. Now this time, here's the runway. They're landing this direction, and you're coming from here. All you have to do is just make a descent and make your way to the runway. So, in this case, here's the runway. I have multiple fixes, or multiple checkpoints if I were to call it. 30 miles, 20 miles, and final approach fix. By 30 miles from the airport, remember this is for straight in. By 30 miles, I want to be at 250 knots. We're basically being configured. And from this point, I can start making my way down to a traffic pattern altitude, or if you're using an instrument approach to back up your visual approach, to the final approach altitude. So you're coming down at 20 nautical miles. This is where I'm going to slow down to at 200 knots. So this is where I'm going to slow down to 200 knots and get really ready for the approach. Before the final approach fix, you would guess it, you are fully configured. So to me, as long as I know the distance from the airport, I can do the straight in approach no problem, right? And between the 20 and 30 nautical miles, right, the same trick is still used, right? If you have to descend from 10,000 feet down to say 3,000 feet for the final approach altitude. Well, bring the part to idle, slow down to below 230 knots, right below the flap speed range, and just dump the flaps 20 and start making your way down, right? Remember, we don't want to be both high and fast, so we're basically killing either one of them. In this case, always speed first for me. Now, I'll add one more to this because sometimes when you're flying to an outstation, you might have seen like a, when you look at the PDC, it says like from ABC or from airport KABC, like direct to a DEF VOR, then direct, basically meaning to your destination airport, right? If you add an instrument approach, if you look at the MFD, you might see the airport code with a distance, like say 84 nautical mile, for example. And then you will see another airport code, the same airport code, with a different distance, say like 60 nautical miles. And then the VOR. Something like this on your MFD, right? So in this case, you're really looking at this one as your distance reference. The other one, the bottom, is including the instrument approach procedure. So this 84 nautical mile is basically including the instrument approach procedure to your airport. So you don't want to use the bottom one, right? That's the no-no. That's the no-no. So you want to use the middle one as your distance reference. There you go. So now the next example that you will see is basically the descent to an outstation without the star. So the scenario here is we took off from DFW airport and we're going back to San Angelo. And we're landing on the runway 36. And if you haven't been to San Angelo, it's basically you're coming from north to the south. So from Dallas to San Angelo, you're coming from north to the south. And San Angelo is using runway 36, meaning you'll have to make a traffic pattern. So that's what we're going to demonstrate on this video. So here we're flying to outstation, in this case the San Angelo. Now San Angelo really don't have an arrival, so we need to have some kind of reference for us to use to calculate the rate of descent. So I'm going to my fixed page, enter the San Angelo airport, and I'm going to use 30 miles to cross. So I'm going to copy and I'm going to put that before the San Angelo VOR. Now remember, if there's any waypoint 30 miles before the San Angelo airport, you might not want to do this because it will conflict. Now here, what I'm also doing is the user waypoint has a similar course to the other waypoints, because if it has a big difference, then there's no point. Like, we'll have to fix it. Now here, the user waypoint and the San Angelo VOR head is close to each other. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell the FMS that I want to cross the user waypoint 250 knots at 12,000, basically 10,000 feet above the field elevation. So here you go, executed it. And now I'm going to go to the direct intercept page and it will show me at what vertical speed that I can descend down to. Now, another way to do this is, instead of using the user waypoint, you can just use the airport and enter the field elevation here, 1920, and I'll execute it. And what's going to happen, if I go to direct intercept page, it will also tell you at what altitude or at what rate of descent that you should be descending to. So if I were to delete that user waypoint, I can still use the airport as the reference. So here, what I'm going to do is they're close to each other, 1300 feet and 1000 feet per minute. Now, SJT, the user waypoint here is using the 12,000 feet as a reference. So it might not be as accurate as the us putting the field elevation on the our destination airport. So what I could do here is I'm going to delete the user waypoint and execute it. Now it makes no difference really. So if you want to use the user waypoint or you just want to use the airport as your reference and just put the field elevation there, you can do that. So here, now it's telling me I should be descending at 1400 feet per minute if I want to go down to 1290 to San Angelo. So now we're getting close to our destination airport, and usually for the outstations approach or the center, they will tell you, I'll say 2 or 3 out of 5 times, they'll tell you descend at pilot discretion, maintain whatever altitude, unless they really need you to start descent now. So if they tell you descend at pilot's discretion, maintain 4,000, that's what I'm doing here right now. I have set the 4,000 feet. Now, as you see, I have started descending at 2,600 feet per minute because I'm looking at the San Angelo airport and it's telling me to descend at 2,400 feet. Okay, so that's not a problem, right? I mean, the only reason we descended at 2,000 feet per minute at Dallas to follow the star, well, we don't have a star to follow. We don't have any airspeed or altitude restriction to follow. So the descent rate is really at our discretion. So that's why I have waited until 2,400 feet per minute to show on the San Angelo, and I'm adding 200 feet for the safety, right? So here we're going to continue descent down at 260 or 2,600, I'm sorry, 260, 2,600 feet per minute. Sorry. And we're going to keep monitor the direct intercept page because if the San Angelo is asking you the shallower rate of descent, then we can adjust it. Remember, we want to be at our whatever altitude as quick as possible, but at the same time, we don't want to be at, in this case, 4,000 right away because the lower we go, that means now we have to add the power back, and now we're trying to cruise at 4,000 feet at 320 knots. Now that's more fuel to burn. So here, I'm still looking at it, the direct intercept page. Now, San Angelo is now asking for 2,300 feet per minute. So I could reduce to 2,500 feet per minute in this case. Now, more than likely in this case, I am looking at the MFD and see what the range to altitude does. Now, since range to altitude shows me that I'll be leveling at 4,000 before I cross the San Angelo VOR, I'm going to reduce the rate of descent based on the San Angelo. Eventually, what I want to do is I want to level out at 4,000 at or after San Angelo VOR or before, right? So here I'm looking at the San Angelo 2,200 feet. So I'm going to shallow it out a bit. Like I said, I want to I want this range to altitude barely touching the San Angelo. So we're crossing the 13,000 feet here. Now remember, we need to be at 250 knots as we cross 10,000 feet. So you will see here soon As I start descend below 12,000 feet, I'm going to reduce the thrust to idle and reduce the rate of vertical descent to 1200 feet per minute. And I'm going to set my altitude airspeed selector, I'm sorry, to 250 knots. So here we go, thrust to idle, rate of descent to 1200 feet per minute, and I'm setting the airspeed to 250 knots. So this is something that most of the instructors will tell you, and it's really easy to use because when you think about it, 12,000 feet to 10,000 feet to lose 32 minus 250, that's 70 knots. That's a good reference. So if you need to slow down earlier or at a higher altitude, you can, just use, it will take 2,000 feet to lose 70 knots. So you can use this at 15,000 feet, go to idle, 1,200 feet per minute, and you'll be at 250 knots around 13,000 feet. So if ATC were to tell you, maintain 250 knots at or below 13,000, then you'll be using these techniques at, let's say, 15,000 feet. So here we are. Now we're getting close to the San Angelo VOR, and if you look outside, you can actually see the airport inside. So here, what I'm doing is I am cleaning up my box. So I have now final intercept course, and I'm going to fly visual. Right. Once you tell the ATC that you have runway in sight, the approach will tell you you're clear for visual to whatever runway. In this case, at San Angelo, we're trying to do a visual approach to runway 36. Now, if this was a straight in, you would have slowed down to 200 knots already. Now, we need to make a traffic pattern here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to maintain 250 knots for now. I'm not going to slow down too early to the point where I'm going to burn more fuel, but I don't want to be too fast at the end, right? So right now we're fast and we're getting close to 4,000. So this is good because we're not both fast and high. So what I'm going to do, now I'm going to start making my downwind turn. Now here, as I made my downwind turn, I have noticed that I have turned a little too late. You want to be somewhere around 5 miles from the airport. So using that 5 mile ring on the MFD, you know that I'm a little too tight for making a traffic pattern. So here what I'm going to do, I'm going to maintain a little to the left of a heading. That way I can get that 5 miles back. Now, as for slowing down, if you have to make a traffic pattern, then the good reference is you would just want to beam the airport. So as you beam the airport, you can start slowing down to 200 knots, start turning base, then you can slow down even further. As you turn final, you can slow down close to your approach speed. So here I am, I have beamed the airport, so I have brought my thrust to idle, and I'm slowing down to 200 knots. And I'm going to adjust my heading. That way I could be at 5 miles from the airport. Now remember, you have been clear for the visual approach, so you should be no problem with making a visual approach. Now, of course, if you were to do this like I am doing in this simulator, might not be a good idea, but I've made my mistake of turning into downwind a little too late, so I'm trying to fix for it before I beam my final fix, in this case, the TIMP. So here I am, 5 miles from the airport. So now I'm going to put myself parallel to the final approach course, and there you have it. From here, as I cross the TIMP, I'm gonna extend my downwind a bit. Now, my line check airman told me that as soon as you abim the temp, or I'm sorry, the final approach fix, you could start turn in because you're doing a visual approach. So you could just make a base turn as you cross the final approach fix and just be prepared to slow down, bring the gear down, flaps 30. Now, if you're new or you're not too confident with about it, like say you have very, very strong headwind or crosswind, you name it, then you can give yourself a bit of a leg room, right? So what I'm going to do, I'm going to slow down first. So here I'm slowing down to 170 knots, and I'm not gonna turn until I have my airspeed or I have configured my aircraft to gear down and flaps 30, you name it, right? So here we are. We have slowed down to 170 knots. So at this point, I have passed the final approach fix. So it is really up to me if I want to make a turn now or later, but this would be a good point to make your turn. Excuse with the FMS. This was not doing exactly what I was expecting to do, like the real world. But here, now I'm making my base turn. And as I get close, I could make my turn for the final, and I can re-engage the nav mode, and I can use my RNAV approach for a backup for the visual approach. So there you have it for the outstation. So now in here, this is the third example that I was talking about earlier. So this one is actually one I got last time when I was flying into the DFW. They were giving us to fly or descend via a Jovam 6, except maintain different airspeed. In this case, it was 310 knots and or greater. So this will be the last video for this one on demonstrating how to do this kind of arrival. And you'll get this a lot when you have a lot of traffics that is coming in for the airport because the air traffic controller wants to basically move whoever is in front of the arrival to move as quick as possible. So here we are with a different arrival. This time, let's say the ATC have assigned you a Jovam 6 arrival into DFW. So looking at it, we have Leaded at 290 knots between flight level 300 and flight level 240. Cross Zubov at between flight level 230 and flight level 200. Then we go to Victory at 280 knots between flight level 180 to 15,000. Then cross Jobim at 270 knots between 15,000 to 13,000. Then Missile at 240 knots, cross at 12,000. Sailor at 210 knots at 12,000. Then Kaboom and Fuel. Now, as I said earlier, this is the basically a different than descend via. Sometimes the ATC will tell you descend via Jovam 6 arrival except maintain 310 knots or greater. So here what I'm going to do, I'm going to just descend at Mach 77 and start descending to my first altitude of flight level 240. And as you can see, I was looking at Victory as my most restricted. So I'm descending at 2200 feet per minute, and I'm going to continue to descend. But what I'm going to do, I am going to continue descent until 320 knots because ATC told us to maintain 310 knots or greater. Now, the profile is that our descent it should be at Mach 77 to 320. Excuse me. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to descend at Mach 77 and I'm going to monitor my rate of descent. As you can see, I will be at flight level 240 at Leiden. Well, I don't want that. So I'm going to reduce my vertical rate of descent. And it looks like at 1800 feet per minute, I should be behind the Leiden, just behind the Leiden. So that's good. So I'm going to continue descent at Mach 77. I'm going to monitor my rate of descent and I will monitor my range to altitude. And somewhere as we descend, ATC will tell you resume publish speed at a waypoint. Now, the reason the arrival or approach does that is because sometimes you have too many traffics coming in from the same direction. So not just you, but there might be 10 or 15 other traffics coming from the west and flying in to the DFW. So they're coming from west to the east. So to control the traffic, right, the ATC basically wants you to speed up, right? They don't want you to slow down to 290 knots at Leiden. Instead, they want you to just speed up to 310 knots or greater. That way you can hit those waypoints as fast as possible. And then as you get close to the airport, they can tell you, okay, now you can resume the published speed. So here, like I said, I'm going to continue descend down to 290 knots, or I'm sorry, Mach 0.77. Like I said, I'm going to ignore the 290 knots speed restriction, but I still need to descend via the Jovan 6 arrival. So I am still looking at the range to altitude and make sure I can descend within that block of altitude. So here, I'm waiting for flight level, say 260 or 250, and making sure that I will be crossing the Leiden at or above flight level 240. Now, I'm getting close to flight level 300. That's good because, as we said earlier, you would rather be within the top altitude, or you want to make sure that you're descending below the top altitude because that guarantees that you'll be crossing that waypoint within the block of altitude. So here you go. We are now descending below flight level 300, and as I see the range to altitude is still behind the Leiden. So that's good. Now, I'm not going to touch my rate of descent yet, but more than likely I'll be adjusting my rate of descent because that range to altitude looks like it's very close to Leiden. I want that range to altitude a little behind, just like that. So that is 1900 feet per minute. So now I'm descending at 1900 feet per minute. I know I'll be crossing the Leiden just above flight level 240, which we want in this case. And there we go. Now we're getting close to flight level 250, so I know I will be able to cross the Leiden, no problem. So I'm going to set my next altitude of flight level 200, and the range to altitude shows that I'll be crossing flight level 200 after Zubov, and that's what we want. So I'm not going to touch the rate of descent again. Same thing, and still, I'm going to maintain Mach 77 to 320 knots, which we have already done here. So we're just continue descent down to see how far or until we see, in this case, flight level 220 or flight level 210 as we get close to flight level 200. So here we are. Now we're crossing flight level 220. I know I can make it to Zubov, no problem. So I'm going to set my next speed or altitude, I'm sorry, 15,000. Range to altitude looks good, so we'll not touch the rate of descent. Now, let's say from here, ATC tells you to resume published speed from victory. So that means they want you to start slowing down to 280 knots as you cross victory. Like we've done earlier in the first example. So 320 to 280, that's 40 knots. So thinking about it, 8 miles from the victory, I can go to idle thrust and reduce the rate of descent to 1200 feet per minute, and I'll just slow down to 280 knots and we'll cross the victory. Now, for now, I'm going to be keeping my eyes on the rate of descent, because if I were to shallow out my rate of descent to slow down, I might miss the top altitude of flight level 180. Now, looking at it, we're getting close to flight level 180 or 18,000 feet. So I think I can comfortably slow down too. So I'm going to just slow down, right? So here I'm basically going thrust idle, set the airspeed to 280 knots, and I'm slowing or reduce the rate of descent to 1200 knots. So, well, I'm sorry, 1200 feet per minute. And as I said earlier, I have done it at 8 mile point. So I'm slowing down. Now, remember, multiple times I've said it, you can use the flight spoilers as your heart's content, right? I mean, no one should be telling you don't use it. You're just being trained to use it as little as possible. So here we go. I'm at 280 knots. Now I can increase my rate of descent. Now looking at my altimeter, we're crossing 17,000 feet. So we're in a good shape. We can cross victory above 15,000. So I have set my altitude to the next lowest, the Jovim, 13,000 feet. And range to altitude shows that I'll be just behind Jovim whenever I cross 13,000 feet. So at 280 knots, now I have to slow down to 270 knots. So here soon you will see somewhere around 3 miles. I'm going to go down to thrust to idle again and reduce the rate of descent to slow it down. And there's my 5 miles from Jovim. There you go. I'm slowing down now, so I'm going to set my speed to 270 knots, thrust to idle, or throttle to idle, and reduce the vertical rate of descent to 1200 feet per minute. So by the time when I cross Jovim, I should be at 270 knots, as you can see here. And I'm going to look at the rate of descent. Now I'm going to increase, no, not increase, but I'm going to set my target altitude first, 12,000 feet. Now I need to cross missile at 12,000. If we were to continue descent at 2,000, we're leveling out too early. So here you can see that I am reducing the rate of descent to 1,000 feet per minute. And even lower, 600 feet per minute now. Like I said, somewhere around less than 1,000 feet per minute descent, it almost feels like you're flying straight and level. So you could anticipate that I'm going to slow down somewhere at 4 or 3 miles. Now, if you're still descending at a higher rate, then your option is possibly to use the speed brake. So here we go. We're getting close to 3 mile points. So on the PFD is showing about 4.2. So I'm going to slow down now. 800 feet per minute descent, that's pretty close to 1,000 feet per minute. So I'm going to slow down now, especially when I have to lose 30 knots. So I'm going to let autopilot just level out naturally. And as we get close to 240 knots, or as we get close to 12,000 feet, airspeed will reduce further without having for me to control the rate of descent. And there you go. Now I am at 240 knots. Now, since we have to cross Sealer at 12,000 feet and 210 knots, we're already at 12,000 feet. So in this case, you just have to slow down from 3 miles from Sealer. So here we just crossed the Sealer, and let's say ATC wants you to start slowing down and descend further. Now from 12,000 to 8,000 or even lower, say 3,000 for the char, that's a lot of altitude to lose. Now, considering the altitude we're high, airspeed at the same time we're also a little bit fast. So we need to either slow down or we need to descend as soon as possible. So now airspeed is already assigned, so we can't do that. So we can't really change the airspeed. Here, what we can do, since ATC has assigned us the new altitude, we can descend a little faster. Looking at the airspeed, we're told to maintain 200. Well, that's below our flap speed for flaps 1, 8, and 20. So in this case, what you can do is you can use the flaps, and as the flaps comes down, that creates a drag. The airspeed will start to reduce. Then you can use the vertical rate of descent, or you can increase the vertical rate of descent to descend faster. Now here we're simulating that we were told to slow down to 180 knots. So here we are. Now you might not be able to see it. Here you will see me getting the flaps down soon. So there you go. The flap is now coming down. That's why I increased the rate of descent. If you noticed, the airspeed was trying to dip lower than 180 knots, and I have increased the rate of descent because the flaps were coming down. So here we go. Now we're turning base, and we still got the flaps in, but not the flaps 30 or geared down. Now, depending on the airports, they might tell you to maintain a certain airspeed until you cross the final fix. So we'll simulate that here. So let's say ATC told you to maintain 170 knots until final fix, in this case bobbin, and you're clear for the visual approach. So here, as you can see, the gear came down and I got the flaps to 30. Now, gear and the flaps, you could have waited a little longer until you're actually lined up, but since looking at the MFD, looks like I'm pretty close to the final fix, so that's why I got my gear down and the flaps 30 at this point. That way, as soon as I make my turn for the final, I'll be able to just, all I have to call out for is check spoilers, flaps 45 before landing check. So here now we have turned to final. Localizer is captured and glide slope is captured. Now remember, we cannot slow down to our approach speed simply because the ATC told us to maintain 170 until final. So all you have to do is fairly simple. As you check yourself, or as you look at the DME, as you cross the final fix, all you have to do is reduce the thrust or the throttle to idle and start slowing down, right? And as you slow down, just call out for check spoilers flaps 45 before landing check. Then what you can do here, I'm crossing final fix, bring the power to the idle, check spoilers flaps 45 before landing check. Your pilot monitoring will tell you what airspeed for the straight in approach speed. And you can just rotate the knob and bring the power back a little more. That way you don't slow down below the approach speed. So there you go. So here we are. We're still descending. The flap has came down. That added the increased drag. So that's how it helped myself to slow down. And all you have to do is just stabilize and continue to the landing. And that's all for now. Or that's all the videos that I have made for now. If I ever get a chance to look at other arrivals to do and demonstrate, I would definitely do that. Now, as I said earlier, or at the very first, or at the very beginning of the video, just remember everybody flies with a different techniques. So just take this as this is one way of doing it, or this is how other people also flies. So if you have your own ways of doing so, feel free to comment about it. Or if you have something to suggest or you have a questions, feel free to put a comment as well. But for now, thanks for watching. I did not expect this video to be almost an hour and 40-minute long. So thanks for, if you actually started watching from the beginning and all the way to the end, my God, good job for you. And if you are wherever you are at for the training, right? Good luck to you. Have fun, really. I've done it before, and I've had an amazing time doing the training with the company. So yeah, so thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys another time. And in case you guys were wondering which software I was using, I was I was using the Prepare 3D version 4, and the aircraft model was from the Aerosoft. So if you're interested, you can look into those two as well. Thank you.